All right, we're in Galatians chapter 1, and we noticed again that Galatians is a very stern letter, or epistle from the Apostle Paul to these brethren who he said he was astonished, just couldn't believe how quickly they had departed from the faith, pure gospel of Christ. Judaizing teachers came in, and we can see from the writing of the book, kind of like 1 Corinthians, when you have to read the answers to determine what the questions were. That's the thing about a letter. It's not a novel. You don't get all the background. You have to determine the context from one side of the conversation. But here, it's easy to see the mode of attack of these false teachers. And in order to get these gullible Christians, these Gentile Christians especially, to accept their proposition that they must also keep either all or at least some or parts of the law of Moses, such as circumcision and other things of that nature. Although, it's interesting, circumcision came before the law of Moses. But it was a big deal because obviously it differentiated them from the rest of humanity at that time. But in order to get them to accept their teaching, they first had to discredit the one who had converted them. Because Paul didn't teach the things they were teaching. So they had to attack his authority and attack his apostleship. And it's easy to see from this letter that the idea was, well, Paul was not he's not a real apostle. All those guys, they were around following Christ. He's not one of those original group. And, he didn't get his gospel directly from Christ like they did. He probably got it from them, perhaps, or maybe from the Judean churches, other Christians, but he didn't get it directly from Christ. And so that's how they made their inroads, and he had turned them, these gospel teachers who had perverted the gospel, he says, they were spiritual perverts, had turned these Galatian Christians into spiritual deserters, the text says in chapter 1. He says, I marvel at your turning away, you're deserting. And so Paul spends the first 2 chapters basically of this book defending himself, defending his apostleship, defending his authority, and he does that in several ways. First, talking about the fact that it would have been impossible for him. He first talks about his past life, where he came from, and then about how, based on the circumstances, it would have been impossible for him to get his gospel from the apostles or others. It had to come from Christ. And then also he goes into in chapter 2 how that they gave me the right hand of fellowship. We'll see that meaning that they understood after I met with them that we're preaching the same thing. Our gospel is the same. And then he spends the latter part of chapter 2 talking about, my life, our conduct, our practice is consistent with the gospel of Christ that we preach. This one and pure, simple gospel. And so those are some of the things that we've been looking at as we got into this study. So let's pick up there. I think we got down to about verses at least 11 and 12. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. It didn't originate. Its source was not men. For I neither received it from man. There was no human agency involved in its transmission to me. Nor was I taught it. Like we're sitting in here today. It's not the way Paul got it. But how did he get it? Yeah, revelation of Christ, or a revelation, some translations say. But we talked about that word revelation. And really a technical term in its use in the New Testament. I mean, it's a general term, right? What's the Greek word for revelation? Apocalypse? Apocalypsis. We call the apocalypse as the book of Revelation. And that's what it means, and yet in the New Testament that word is used in a very technical sense in that it is a direct, God's direct, giving His word directly, revealing Himself and His word. And so that's how Paul says, I got it. And so what's the evidence for that? Well, verse 13. For you have heard of my former conduct in what? You've heard of my former conduct in what? The Jews' religion. The New King James says Judaism. That's kind of interesting phraseology, isn't it? He didn't say you've heard of my former conduct as I practiced the law of Moses, right? The Jews' religion had a lot of what tacked onto it? It had a lot of oral traditions, which were put down, was that the Mishnah? And so they had a lot of tradition tacked onto their religion. So I think Brother Wakecaster, even in his commentary, pointed out that had Paul, frankly, had the Jews and the Jewish leaders of the day been only following the law of Moses, rather than so intent on following their traditions, they probably would have been able to see what in the law of Moses? They should have been able to see Christ in the law of Moses. There's not a book in the Bible that's not about Christ. And Paul says in Romans the law was, a schoolmaster. He was a pedagogue. He was a tutor. He was the guy that leads the kids he's not the teacher, he's the guy that leads the kids from home to the schoolhouse, more or less. Right? He was that slave, that bondservant. And if you knew the law, Christ said, if you knew the law, if you knew the Scripture, they are those that testify of me. Right? And so, but Paul says his former conduct in the Jews' religion or Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure. You couldn't have done it any better than I did. And tried to destroy it. I think that word, King James says laid waste or something of that. It's like a conquering army. That's the idea of the Greek. They're ravaging the countryside. And I think the King James says profited, but this is a good translation in the New King James. I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my peers, contemporaries in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous. Now notice, what's he zealous for? Is he zealous for the law of Moses? The traditions of my father. And that's kind of the way people are. How many friends and relatives do you have in the denominational world that are zealous for what? What mom and daddy believed. The traditions of my father. But it's interesting, and we've talked about this before with Paul and me. When Paul was converted, it changed his heart. But it didn't really change his personality, did it? Let's think about him before. He says, now here's young Paul sitting in the school of Gamaliel, probably surrounded by other students his same age. And he's the guy that always busts the curve that nobody likes. Right? He's running circles around everybody else. He's advancing far ahead of those his own age. To the point that the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, actually, he was pretty prominent in their sect. Right? They're throwing their coats at him when they're stoning Stephen, and he's the one leading the persecution in Acts chapter 9. Think how far ahead he was of anybody else his age. He was that guy. So how different was he after he became a Christian? Personality-wise, how different was he? He said, I excelled above them all. He said these other apostles. I mean, he's still doing it. I mean, I think it kind of makes it easy to see why the Lord, we always say look down the stream of time. He didn't look down anything. There wasn't a stream of time for him. But why the Lord knew before Paul was born that this is a guy you want on your side. Take the gospel. Look how hard he's willing to work. And look what he was willing to go through. And so he says, I'm that guy. Well, what's your point, Paul? But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace. Now, he was called through what? We're called by what? Grace, and specifically by what? How are we called today? Same way he was called, right? Called by the gospel. But he was separated like some other prophets of old. God says, I'm going to use these people in my service. But he didn't override their free moral agency. To reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately... Well, let's stop right there. Go over to Acts. Talking about Paul. I mean, look at the way he describes himself. Look at the way he describes himself. Well, you know from chapter 9, he's breathing out threats and murder against the disciple of the Lord. And that just kind of gives the historical account. But go over to chapters 20. Let's look at 22 and 26. Because again, I mean, thinking of the description we just read, what all he was doing, ravaging the Lord's church. Look at the way he describes it over there. In 22, he says, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the sea at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, was zealous toward God, as you are all today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prison both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters, and went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. Paul was always honest with where he came from. Go over to 26, and I find that in 26 to be even more interesting in the way he describes it. His manner of life from his youth, verse 4. Strictest of the religion, I lived a Pharisee, strictest sect. Now notice verse 9. Indeed, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. This also did in Jerusalem. Many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest. And notice this phrase. And when they were put to death, what did he do? I cast my vote against them. What does that mean? Yeah, not just Stephen, but others. I mean, they actually took a vote, and he voted for death. I punished them often in every synagogue and compelled them to blaspheme, and being exceedingly enraged or mad against them. Now, that's where he was. So what's your point, Paul? My point is this, he says to these Galatians. How else do you explain my conversion? What man could have converted me to Christ? Let's think about this. What man? First of all, what man? Here's the really interesting thing. What man would have approached him? Paul's going all over the place, going into houses, pulling out men and women, dragging them off to prison, putting them to death. What Christian is going to walk up to Paul and say to him, Paul, would you like to sit down and have a Bible study? I'm concerned about your soul. Who's going to do that in the first century? Who in this room would do that? Let's have a Bible study. Well, you might as well just say, shoot me now. Just put the bullet in between my eyes right now. Nobody, Paul says, nobody was going to approach me with the gospel. But Christ did. Christ appeared to him and changed his viewpoint. So, that's the point. That's how I was a fanatic. a zealot. But he goes on, he says, not only that, but I did not have an opportunity to get this gospel from other people, the apostles or anybody else for that matter. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Now, Paul was baptized in Damascus, right? And he leaves Damascus and he goes off to Arabia. Now, there's some difference of opinion in the commentators about what this Arabia is. It could be what we know as the Arabian Peninsula. Others believe it's just some desert region on the outskirts of Damascus. But nevertheless, it's pretty, and I think it's a pretty reasonable conclusion that he goes off into privacy and seclusion to receive what? His revelation. Yeah. He goes off and receives his revelation. He's seen the risen Lord, so he now qualifies as an apostle. And now he must receive his revelation. And then he goes back to Damascus and he's preaching and he's teaching. And that's got everybody shocked. And what ends up happening? They try to take his life, and he has to be, according to the book of Acts, let down in a basket on the wall to flee. But notice, how long did all this take? It's always interesting to me when I read the book of Acts. You read the book of Acts, and man, it sounds like, just a few weeks are going by, and we know that it was 10 years before Cornelius was converted. And you think, okay, Paul, you read the book of Acts, and Paul's converted in Damascus, and then he goes up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and you think, man, things are moving here. That's not what happened at all. Is it? He says, then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and remained with him 15 days. So, make sure we understand the timeline. Paul's converted. He goes into this desert region, receives his revelation, comes back and starts preaching in Damascus, and then eventually has to flee. All that takes about 3 years. That's 3 years following his conversion. And what does he do? So what does he do? He goes to Jerusalem. And how long is he there? 15 days. What could you get in 15 days? Did he go to Jerusalem to go to school with the apostles and let them teach him? What does he say? He says, I went up there to see Peter. That's an interesting word, see. This Greek word really means to visit or become acquainted with. I think there's one verse, I think the New American Standard says, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Peter. I came up to visit. I didn't go there to learn from him, have him teach me. I just wanted to get to know him. And that's about all you could do in 2 weeks' time. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Well, James is a half-brother of the Lord, right? Same fellow that wrote the book of James, who was an elder and a pillar there in the church in Jerusalem. Now, sometimes people get all hung up on the fact that this word apostle is used. Well, we've seen that in other places, right? Barnabas is called an apostle in Acts 14:14. Because the word apostle, that Greek word, means what? Yeah, one sent with a message. And so it could be used in a general sense, but not in a specifically technical sense. And I think Brother Tom points out in his commentary, we've already talked about these Greek words for other earlier in the chapter, right? There's this other gospel, which is better translated in mine. It says, back up in verse 6, to him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another. Now in the King James it says, it uses the same word other twice for the two different Greek words. One is, there's a difference in kind, whereas the other is not. Maybe a difference in numerical or something of that nature. the difference between divers and diverse. So, I mean, Paul is talking about in verse 6, you've got another whole different kind of gospel that you're living by. But here, this word other is used, it's the same way. I saw none of the other apostles except James. And so that word other, he says, I saw none of the other apostles of a different kind, but I did see James. James was not one of the apostles as we think of the Lord's special group, his ambassadors. But he was an important figure in the first century church. And like Barnabas, he could be an apostle in general sense as one sent with a message. And then what did he do after he left Jerusalem? We know this from the book of Acts, right? He went where? He says here Syria and Cilicia. Specifically, where did he go? According to Acts. Where did Barnabas find him? Tarsus. His hometown is in Cilicia. And I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ. I didn't get my gospel, by the way, from anybody over there in the churches of Judea. I didn't get it from the apostles. I didn't get it from Peter. I didn't get it from these churches. But all they knew was, he who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith, which he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God in the midst. Most of the commentaries, that you read give you a good timeline. Tom does that in his. Let me read this. So after his conversion, Paul starts to preach and teach in Damascus, but doesn't have his commission. He then goes into Arabia to receive, most likely, his revelations, to equip him to do the work of an apostle. He then returns to Damascus, and that takes approximately 3 years, we're told here. He then goes to Jerusalem to visit Peter. That's 15 days. After the visit to Jerusalem, he goes back to Tarsus, Acts 9, verse 30. Barnabas then goes to Tarsus in Acts chapter 11 and basically grabs Paul and says, we're going to Antioch. They then go back to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 11 for the purpose of taking relief to the poor saints. And then in Acts chapter 12, toward the end of 12, beginning of 13, what do? They head out on their first missionary journey, right? And then after that, we have this controversy that we'll talk about in chapter 2. The Jerusalem Conference, which arose because of what? The same thing that Paul's dealing with here. Circumcision. Jewish Christians, Judaizing teachers, trying to bind circumcision on the Gentile Christians. And so, that's what we get into in chapter 2. Any questions or comments? Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Brother Waycaster says if Paul gave his vote, and I don't remember, how was this voting done? I used to hear it was like a white marble, black marble, white marble and a black marble. You pick up one, and I guess the vote maybe could have been, you didn't have to. I don't know if you had to reveal who was voting what, but the point that Brother Tom's making is, it sounds like if he had a vote as far as putting Christians to death, that he may very well have been a member of the Sanhedrin. That wasn't the Jewish council which made those kinds of decisions. How many people in the Sanhedrin? 70, right? 70. And here's the thing. Who else was members of the Sanhedrin? Famous people from the New Testament. Christians, perhaps. Or I guess they were followers of Christ. Nicodemus. Who? Joseph of Arimathea. But it's an interesting thought because, again, it emphasizes to us, what an overachiever this man was. If he was that, he was a young man, fairly young. Now, remember, when we talk about young man, that's all kind of relative. When I say the word young, we say the word young in our society, we think of what? What do you think of? You think somebody's young. A young adult. Anybody's out of high school, basically, right? Well, anybody younger than you, yeah. Yeah, we think of young adults. Well, that's college age. But Timothy was a young man, and when Paul wrote to him, he was probably what? Maybe 35 years old, something like that. So you were a young person. I don't know. Timothy had been able to drive back then, but nevertheless, he's referred to as a young man. Well, my point is, if Paul was a member of the Jewish council, then it really emphasizes his achievements and how much of an overachiever he was. And it's interesting that Christ took him and just took the same man personality-wise and said, hey, now you're going to work for me. You're on the wrong side. And to Paul's credit, he changed his heart and he admitted he was on the wrong side. So, but notice, he who formerly persecuted us now preaches what? The faith, gospel, Christ, which he once tried to destroy. Yeah.
You indicated that Paul changed his attitude, but I'd like to put another concept here right alongside that. He not only changed his attitude, he changed his behavior. His behavior was the thing that was changed. Usually there's a difference. I worked for an organization one time that they said, we don't care nothing about the person's attitude, we care about his behavior. Well, I have a problem with that.
Well, yeah, because...
But he also changed his behavior.
Well, the Sermon on the Mount teaches us that behavior always emanates from what? Behavior results from what? Yeah, your attitude, your heart. It's a reflection of what's inside. And so, in order to truly change behavior, you've got to change the inside first. And so, yes, Paul changed his heart, which resulted in the change of his behavior. What I said was, it didn't change a good portion of his personality. You know, we're all born with different personalities. But he did change his heart, and he did change his behavior, his conduct.
He was an enthusiastic person.
Absolutely. It didn't matter, and it didn't matter what he was doing.
Yeah.
He was not only enthusiastic, but he's one of those you would put up as an example of when we try to tell people, you know, you should always, give it your best. I mean, Paul was one of those 110% kind of people. I mean, that's the deal. We talk about sports fans. Well, fans is just an abbreviated version of what word? Fanatics. Paul was a fanatic. I guess we should ask ourselves the same question. Are we fanatics for the Lord? Would anybody accuse me of being a fanatic? If they wouldn't, then maybe I need to change a little bit. So we get to his next argument regarding his authority and the genuineness of his apostleship and his message, and that is that, hey, I'm preaching the same thing. I'm preaching the same thing that the other apostles are preaching, and you know what? They know that. They understood that. They endorsed the gospel that I was preaching. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. Then after 14 years, now I've seen this explained two different ways. I don't know. You'll have to do your own study on that. Because of the word then after 14 years. A lot of commentators take the position that the 14 years is to be added on to the 3 years. Other commentators take the position that the 14 years is inclusive of 3 going back to the time of his conversion. I don't know. And they've all got their own timelines for that and what year the Jerusalem conference is supposedly took place. But after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem. And now, he does not mention, by the way, the visit in Acts chapter 11 where he takes the relief for the poor. It's not mentioned at all in this book. This is his third time to go to Jerusalem. He went to visit with Peter, get acquainted with Peter. He took some relief for poor saints. And now he's going back for this conference. After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and also took Titus with me. Now, the interesting thing about this is, you go into the discussion of this conference in Acts, and you will find that Titus is not mentioned. Let's go over to Acts chapter 15. And we talked about this when we studied the book of Titus here, and we just finished up with Titus. But a lot of commentators believe that the reason that Titus is not mentioned at all, even though Titus was obviously an important part of Paul's team, just like Timothy. Well, it's interesting that Titus is not mentioned in the book of Acts. And generally, I think a lot of commentators believe that the explanation for that is the same reason that Luke's not mentioned in the book of Acts. Who wrote the book of Acts? And who traveled with Paul during significant sections of the book of Acts? You know, we went here and we went there, Luke did. But Luke never mentions his own name, obviously out of some, sense of humility. And he doesn't mention Titus either. And it's a little coincidental, I guess, that Luke is a Greek or he's a Gentile, and so is who? Titus. So the conclusion that's drawn by many commentators is that Titus is a brother of Luke. That's why Luke doesn't mention him. But he's with them. And so you look at chapter 15, certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them. They determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others, well, there's Titus, he's mentioned right there. Certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. Now, when you read that, you read it that way, it kind of sounds like, well, we're going to go up to Jerusalem and find out what the others say about it and get some direction. Right? We're going to go up there to the apostles and elders about this question. Is that what's meant here? No. Because I go back to Galatians and I read verse 2. He took Titus, and Paul says I. Why didn't he say we, us? I'm the apostle here, by the way, Galatian people, you ingrates. After what all I've done for you, he's exerting his authority here. He says, look, I went up by what? Revelation. None of these other guys that went with me, by the way, Barnabas and these certain others, they didn't go up by revelation. Okay? I did. I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. Paul says, I'm the apostle here, and I was told directly by the Spirit of Christ, you go to Jerusalem about this matter, and you confer with the other men who are of the same apostolic authority as you. Now, why did he take Titus? We'll see that. I went up by revelation. See, we get some things filled in here. Because they go up there and, get over there in Acts chapter 15, and Paul and Barnabas rehearse what all has been done. And it's interesting before this meeting ever got started. Did you notice in Acts chapter 15, before the meeting ever got started, that all the apostles and the leaders in the Jerusalem church were already on the same page? You know why they were on the same page? Why were they on the same page? When the council got going and they got together, well, it says there'd been much dispute, verse 6 of Acts chapter 15. Well, dispute among who? Among those that are trying to push this stuff off on them. And it said Peter gets up and talks about the conversion of Cornelius. Then Paul and Barnabas get up and talk about what all they've done with, taking the gospel to Gentiles. The point I'm trying to make is they had already rehearsed what they were going to do. How do I know that? I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but what? Privately. To those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Now, he uses, sometimes you read this, those who were of reputation, he's not using that in a derogatory sense. I mean, these people, Paul, Peter, and James, and the other apostles, they were of reputation, and they deserved the reputation they had. It wasn't because they were pushing it. What he says is, I got there, we met privately, and we discovered what? In our meeting privately. What did we discover? We're all teaching the same thing. We have the same gospel. We're all on the same page. We go into this meeting, and we're already on the same page. And he said, yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So, what was the purpose of Titus? Did Paul take Titus on purpose in this meeting? Yeah. Why? Yeah, he's a test case. Here's a Gentile. He's a Christian. He hasn't been circumcised. And we talked about this when we studied Titus, but Titus obviously was a pretty, personality-wise, pretty strong person. I mean, you think about it, Paul sends him where? He sends him to Crete to work with a bunch of Cretans. You ever called somebody a Cretan? He sends him to Crete to straighten out a bunch of liars. This guy's tough. He says, Titus, the Lord's appeared to me. We're heading to Jerusalem, and guess what? You're going with us, and man, they're going to be after you. Those Judaizing teachers. That guy needs to be circumcised. No. We're not keeping the law of Moses anymore. Not any of it. Unless it just happens to be the same thing.
I see him as a perfect visual aid.
Yeah, visual aid.
Nothing replaces a visual aid.
And again, different from the situation with Timothy. Timothy was half Jew and half Gentile. And in order to comply with culture and not to be a stumbling block, Timothy voluntarily was circumcised. He wasn't compelled. So, that's fine. Yeah, I'll submit to circumcision so that it's just not a big deal for these people. But here is a whole different situation. You've got a Gentile, and you got these Judaizing teachers saying, he has to be circumcised. No, we're not going to make him. And this occurred because of false brethren. And isn't this the way it always happens? This occurred because of false brethren secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus. They might bring us into bondage, to whom we did not yield submission even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. That's kind of the way it is, isn't it? False teachers. Secret, stealth. They're like spiritual James Bonds, right? They're spies. They were looking for an opportunity. And what does that tell you about the person who operates that way? Yeah, I think that's a good word. That's the word I was thinking. Dishonest. You believe something? Well, be upfront with people. I can remember back in Knight Arnold days, we've been out here 20 years. We had a couple of students come through the school. We were 80, 70 people. Didn't tell the soul. Never raised it in class. Never argued about it. Until they got their certificate. They graduated Memphis School of Preaching. If you do that, you're a dishonest person. You don't understand what it means to be a Christian. Well, the bell is on.
Okay,
Yep.
those students also tried to use their graduation from school here to further their
Yeah.
bad teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, see, we're endorsed by the Memphis School of Preaching. We have graduated from there. That's a sorry person. That's what Paul would say. Just sorry behavior. I mean, we got people that, in the church, we think we know the book, we got all this knowledge, we've never really understood it or imbibed it in our own lives and character. Which is what it's all about. It's about changing. All right, we'll pick up here next week.